It was Halloween night, and the sky looked like a thick black canvas, impenetrable by any light. The only thing illuminating our path were the rare streetlights, casting faint shadows on the old, abandoned houses. Their boarded-up windows and crumbling roofs resembled giant mouths, ready to swallow anyone who dared to come closer. Ketrin and I were walking home after a party. She insisted we take a shortcut through this neighborhood. I didn't like walking here even during the day, and at night this place felt like a trap for anyone without a choice. Locals called it the Shadow District. Stories about ghosts and madmen living here had been passed down for years, but who could tell where the truth ended and the legends began? We walked in silence. The wind howled through the broken windows, and sometimes I thought those weren't just random sounds but voices, pleading for help. My heart started beating faster with every step, though I tried not to show Ketrin that I was scared. She walked beside me, tightly gripping my hand, and I focused on that, trying to ignore the terrifying shadows around us. I'm cold, she whispered, pressing closer to me. I just nodded, feeling the chill not just in her skin but in the air around us. We walked a few more blocks when I noticed something move in the corner of my eye. A tall figure, draped in a dark ghost costume, stood beneath a street lamp, staring directly at us. Its featureless face glowed faintly, and I felt as if its eyes were piercing straight into my soul. What is that? I whispered, but Ketrin stayed silent. I felt her hand go cold, and when I looked at her, her eyes were wide with fear. Let's just keep walking, she croaked out. We took a few steps forward when we heard heavy footsteps behind us. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't help myself. The figure was moving toward us, gliding across the ground as if it wasn't even walking. Run, I shouted, grabbing Ketrin's hand. We bolted, but her hand slipped from mine. I stopped and turned. Ketrin was gone, nowhere to be seen. My heart pounded in my chest and my head spun. Ketrin, I shouted, but only silence responded. The wind whistled through my ears, the only sound that broke the dreadful quiet. I rushed back to where she had vanished, but there was nothing there, just darkness and sinister shadows. My breath became ragged and the fear gripped me tighter. Then, suddenly I heard a sound. A door creaked softly nearby. I turned and saw an old abandoned house. Its door cracked open just a few inches. My feet carried me toward it on their own, even though every instinct screamed to run the other way. But I couldn't leave Ketrin behind. I approached the door and pushed it open. It swung back slowly, revealing the dim, musty interior. The air inside was thick, filled with dust and decay. The stairs in front of me creaked as if they hadn't been touched in years. All the windows were boarded up, leaving the house in almost complete darkness. I stood in the empty hallway, unsure of where to go. Ketrin, I whispered, hoping for a response. Instead, I heard a muffled sound, a soft but distinct noise. It was coming from deeper inside the house, like a faint cry or whisper, muffled by thick walls. I took a few steps forward, trying to locate where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be calling me downstairs. An old staircase on the right side led to the basement. A dim light barely peeked through the cracks in the floorboards, but that's where the sound was coming from. Gathering all my courage, I started descending. The stairs wobbled and creaked beneath my weight, but I kept moving. Halfway down, the door above me slammed shut with a loud bang. I jumped, my nerves fraying, but I forced myself to stay calm. Fear was flooding my senses, but I had to keep going. Ketrin was here somewhere, I was sure of it. The basement was dark and damp. From one corner, I heard the sound of water slowly dripping from the ceiling, echoing off the stone floor. But that wasn't the most terrifying sound. The soft crying grew louder. It was coming from a small room at the end of the corridor. I approached and, cautiously opening the door, saw her. Ketrin was sitting on the floor, curled up, hugging her knees. Her face was pale, and her eyes were vacant, staring into nothingness. She wasn't crying, but her lips were moving, silently whispering something I couldn't understand. Ketrin, I rushed to her, grabbing her shoulders. "What happened? Are you okay?" She didn't respond. Her cold fingers barely brushed against my wrist, and suddenly I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I recoiled, and that's when I saw them. In the corner of the room stood the same figures I had seen outside. Their bodies were dressed in costumes: ghosts, clowns, demons, and each figure was as pale as death. They stared at me with empty eyes, but I could feel that they weren't just watching. They were waiting. I tried to lift Ketrin to her feet, but her body was heavy and limp. I didn't know if I could get her out of here, but I had no other choice. I began dragging her toward the door when I felt something cold grip my shoulder. I turned. One of them had grabbed me. Its faceless head was so close that I could feel its icy breath on my skin. Panic surged through me, and I shoved it away, but its fingers clung tightly. The others began closing in, forming a circle around us. "You won't leave," whispered a voice, echoing from all sides, but from none of their mouths. It was a trap. They didn't want us to leave, and while I couldn't understand exactly what these beings were, whether they were people or something else, their horrifying intent was clear. I hit the hands of the figure again, harder this time, and felt its grip loosen. Dragging Ketrin with me, I bolted for the stairs. They were right behind us, their footsteps echoing just inches from my back. As we reached the staircase, one of the figures suddenly appeared in front of us, blocking the way. It leaned forward, and I saw its face transform from a blank, pale mask into something grotesque and inhuman, with torn skin and a wicked grin. "You will never return," it whispered with a smirk. That grin was the final straw. I mustered all my strength and charged straight at the creature, shoving it aside. We barely made it through the door, and I slammed it shut behind us just as a loud thud echoed from the other side. Breathing heavily, we stood on the cold pavement, trembling. The air outside was eerily silent. I looked back at the house. It was just as old and abandoned as it had been before. No screams, no movement, just empty windows and a gloomy facade. Maybe it was just a nightmare. But I knew better. "Let's get out of here," Ketrin whispered weakly. We didn't speak on the way home. Only when we reached our neighborhood did I stop to catch my breath. I glanced back. Those figures weren't following us anymore, but their terrifying gaze still burned into my back. From that night on, we never walked through the Shadow District again. Whatever it was, it left us alone, but those faces and cold hands still haunt me in my nightmares.